Hey guys, the Comics Kid 2099 here to once again talk about an episode of an animated superhero television series. Today I will be talking about the Season 1 finale of Batman Beyond, but before I tell you what I thought about this episode, I'll be spoiling it. So if you forgot what happened, or if you don't want to know, either stick around and listen to me talk, or leave before I do so. Either way, you've been warned. Derek Powers' condition of being a radioactive superhuman is getting worse, and so he decides to air quotes resign as the CEO of Wayne Powers and let his son, who we've never seen or heard of before, act as his proxy. But things get quickly out of hand when immediately Powers is exposed as being the supervillain Blight and must go on the run. Batman, still angry that Powers had his father killed naturally, works with Paxton to bring him powers, but quickly regrets this as Powers' powers, no pun intended, go out of control and Paxton betrays Batman. As the episode ends, it's left unclear if Powers survived the exploding submarine, and Batman leaves Paxton with an ominous warning that Powers won't be so easily defeated. Cue credits. As far as season finales go, this one packs quite a bit of a punch, especially when you consider that this series came at a time when television wasn't nearly as serialized as it is now. Back then, it wasn't so much expected that you watch the episodes in order so that you can get the entire story, with each episode acting as a sort of chapter in a larger story. That goes double for cartoons, really. But season 1 of this series is quite different than the other seasons, in that it does kinda sorta have a recurring big bad, to use the Buffy the Vampire Slayer lingo. Derek Powers was introduced in the two-part premiere and was set up to be a supervillain as well as a behind-the-scenes villain. Unfortunately, he only really had one outing as a supervillain, not counting this episode. But I would wager that this is because he was just more interesting as normal human Derek Powers than he was as supervillain Blight. And after the premiere set him up as a recurring threat, we got to see him just often enough to remind us that he was still a looming threat, but not so often that he got tiresome, or you absolutely had to watch all of the episodes just to get what was going on with Powers every time he showed up. And this episode sort of concludes that little mini arc for this series, and I would even say it's done in a really good way, though I do have some complaints which I will address first. One thing that only kinda slightly irked me was the way that Terry has to take so long to find out what the audience has known since the very beginning, namely that Powers is Blight. This would be infinitely more frustrating if the show was acting like it was some big mystery that the characters had to solve. Who could this Blight character be? And every episode Batman tries to find out. Well, it's not the gardener, maybe it's the head of security. We'll look into that next week. But all along, we know who it is. That would be really terrible. This isn't some big mystery that the show is trying to string along, but still, it is a little frustrating when the characters are the last ones to find out about something. It just makes me feel like they are a little slow on the uptake when we've known this all along. There's no other way that this could have been handled, especially since if Terry knew that Powers was Blight before this episode, then you wouldn't be able to end the season with this episode. Still though, it's mildly frustrating. On to a slightly bigger issue I had. We see early in this episode that whenever Powers' temper flares, that his powers burn through his synthetic skin quicker. In fact, we've known that ever since the episode Meltdown. And this little tidbit is crucial in Paxton manipulating everything so that he can be the new CEO of Wayne Powers without having to deal with his father pulling the strings behind the scenes. But just how in blue blazes did Paxton find out that Powers' powers burned hotter whenever he was mad? That isn't exactly an intuitive guess or anything. Even in an approximation of the DC universe, you don't have tons of dudes running around with radioactive powers. So you don't just assume, you know, when he gets mad, I bet he gets more powerful. You could say that he bribed the scientists working for his father to tell him, and that's very likely and possible, especially with how cutthroat the business world is. But if that's how he found out, I'd have liked to have seen some confirmation of that. Even a quick line mentioning it, like when we saw that Mr. Mendez was working for Paxton, that would have been enough. And speaking of Mr. Mendez, that dude has dedication to the craft of acting. He's wearing that humble fisherman suit that he was wearing when he did his spiel to unmask Powers all the way through this episode. Talk about your method actors. One thing I noticed when watching this episode that never occurred to me in the past was that Paxton is kinda like the Smallville rendition of Lex Luthor. Think about it. When Derek's servant lady comes to get Paxton, he specifically uses the word exile, a word that Lex Luthor also equated with his stay in Smallville in the series Smallville, at least at first. And we've also got the strained relationship with his father. Admittedly, even if Batman Beyond had been the arc-based series that I've been saying that I wish it was all along, it wouldn't have had the room to show the political maneuvering between the Powerses that we got to see in Smallville. Smallville between the Luthors. In fact, the biggest difference between Paxton and Lex is that, even at the height of his game, I don't think Lex would have ever succeeded so completely against his father. Remember that the only time that Lex ever really beat his father was when he resorted to, spoiler, pushing him out of a window, not when it came to boardroom tactics. In that regard, Lex was always the student and never the master, and in fact, often he was the unwilling student to the master. Paxton, though, almost effortlessly defeats his father before we've even had time to get to know him. Of course, you could also argue that Smallville was a prequel, and that is why Lex was so wet behind the ears in business terms. So you could say that Paxton has already moved past all of that, and is what Lex might have been near the end of Smallville if that series hadn't gotten terribler over time. Also, it would appear that Paxton is just a bad apple from the start, unlike Lex. But again, you could argue that, just like Lex, Paxton had bad upbringing. And if we had seen him in his youth, we might have even seen a little hint of him becoming a better person had he grown up under someone else's influence. And last thing about Paxton before I move on to my final point. Isn't it a little crazy that Wesley from The Princess Bride is voicing Paxton here? Yes, I know that Carrie Ulwis has a career outside of that movie, but still I am continuing to be impressed that acting talents who I did not think would grace this show with their presences are indeed gracing this show with their presences. And unlike William H. Macy in Disappearing Ink, I did not recognize Ulwis's voice here, and I knew it was him going in. I know that Paxton does make one more appearance in this series, but Ulwis does not voice him there, which is a shame since I do like that actor, but since I didn't even recognize his voice, maybe it's not such a big deal that someone else is picking up the character after him. And speaking of Paxton making at least one more appearance later on, that is my final note about this episode. I've talked several times, both in reviews for episodes of this series and in some of my missed opportunities videos, about how the series started off with the corporate espionage angle, and by the end of the first season, it had pretty much abandoned that in favor of setting more stories closer to Terry's school and classmates. This was due to the influence of the higher-ups who wanted this series to be more like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which is ironic since Buffy the Vampire Slayer spent less of half of its runtime set in and around the high school. In all of the commentaries and extra features on the DVDs that I've listened to, it sounds to me like the creators of this show actually preferred the corporate angle that they were working with in Season 1, but when the person signing the checks wants it done a certain way, what can you do? Still, it's just a shame that not only did the series lose what I thought made it a very interesting show in the first place, but also, immediately after introducing a new bad guy in the form of Paxton Powers, the show essentially ignores him for the rest of the series. Even with the mandate to make the show more high schooly, I still think we could have squeezed in more than just one more appearance with this guy. It just makes introducing him in this episode seem like a waste, since he will only show up once more, and even then he's not going to be the main antagonist of that episode. Overall, I really dug this episode. It's a great wrap-up to a great season. I can't say enough good things about it. I mentioned in the comments of one of my previous reviews that outside of Season 1, my memories of this series are really fuzzy. I've watched every episode of this series at least once, but Season 1 is the season that I've rewatched more than any other season. I think it'll be fun to return to Season 2 and see how fondly I look at it in comparison to Season 1. But before that, next Saturday, I'll be talking about an episode of Batman the Animated Series, and the weekend after that is when I'll be returning to Batman Beyond, and during the week I'll be doing other kinds of videos, mostly reviews. I hope you guys liked this episode as much as I did, and my review of it, and if you did like my review, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. And until next time, have a great rest of the day.